The sun filtered through the tall trees, casting long, dappled shadows across the forest floor as Sophia adjusted her sunglasses. Her eyes scanned the quiet scene, but her mind was far from it. The picnic had seemed like a good idea at first, a way to reconnect, a simple moment of peace away from the endless grind of daily life. Ronnie, her husband, had promised this would be different, no work, no distractions. That here she was, lying on a blanket, her thoughts adrift as her husband and children disappeared into the woods. Leaving her alone, she glanced at the small makeshift camp they'd set up bright, colorful picnic blankets, a cooler full of food, and a few scattered bags. The sound of laughter had echoed earlier as the kids ran through the woods, but now is eerily quiet. Only the distant chirping of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves disturbed the silence. She should have felt relief, maybe even contentment. But instead, she felt a strange ache in her chest. It wasn't the physical kind. No, this was something deeper. Sophia closed her eyes, letting the sun warm her face. The crisp, cool air of the forest wasn't enough to shake the heaviness inside her. Her mind wandered to her marriage. Was this all there was to it? The routine of work, the casual exchanges of affection that were more like obligations now? She had tried to make things work, to revive the spark she once shared with Ronnie, but the harder she tried, the further it seemed to slip away. He had promised her this picnic would be a chance to rekindle their connection, but as the day stretched on, it was clear to her that nothing was going to change. It wasn't that Ronnie didn't care, he did in his way. But his work always came first. It had been this way for years. She had become used to it, or at least she thought she had. When he and the children had ventured into the woods to gather firewood, she had stayed behind, telling herself it was a chance to relax. But now, with the family out of sight, the solitude seemed oppressive. That's when Bernard came over to her. The St. Bernard had been with them for a few months now, a Christmas miracle of sorts. He'd wandered into their yard on a cold night, his fur matted with snow, and they had taken him in. Bernard had always been affectionate, always by her side. He was a constant presence in the house, loyal and playful, offering her an unconditional comfort that she hadn't realized she needed until he was there. He'd become a silent, furry companion in her otherwise chaotic life. Now, as Bernard settled beside her, his large head resting gently on her lap, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. The warmth of his body against hers, his soft breathing, was oddly soothing. It reminded her of simpler times before life became so complicated. She stroked his fur absent-mindedly at first, but then something shifted. His gaze met hers, those dark brown eyes full of something she couldn't quite read. There was an intensity in them, something deeper than the usual affection he gave. She paused, fingers still tangled in his thick coat, as if sensing that something was different. Bernard moved slightly, his large frame shifting closer to her. At first, it was just a subtle shift, a nudge that might have been innocuous. But then, with a quiet, gentle motion, he placed his massive paws on her chest, leaning his weight against her. She blinked, confused for a moment, then let out a nervous laugh. "Bernard, what are you doing?" she murmured, her voice a little too shaky. The dog's gaze never left hers. He nudged his head further into her lap, pressing against her thighs, and she could feel the warmth of his breath against her skin. There was nothing overtly threatening about it. In fact, his movements were slow, deliberate, and strangely tender. It felt almost as if he were trying to comfort her, trying to fill the empty space that Ronnie had left behind. Sophia pushed the thought away, laughing it off as just a moment of oddity. But as Bernard continued to nuzzle against her, she felt a tightening in her chest. Her heart began to race, and an unfamiliar sensation crept through her. There was something both comforting and unsettling about his proximity. She could feel the heat of his large body, the weight of his paws pressing against her as if he was trying to hold her in place. She hadn't asked for this. It was supposed to be a simple moment of solitude, not this. Intimacy. Her hand froze on his fur. The peacefulness she had tried to embrace was slipping away. Was this really happening? The sudden rush of awareness made her pulse quicken. She could feel the heat rise in her cheeks. What was this? She could feel a strange pull between them, an attraction she had never expected. It was disorienting, yet in a way it felt comforting too. But she couldn't dwell on it. She had to pull herself together. It was just a dog. But the thoughts came unbidden, swirling around in her mind. Maybe it wasn't just the dog. Maybe it was the isolation, the loneliness. Ronnie had been distant for months now, and she hadn't been able to admit it to herself, let alone to anyone else. She'd been starved for connection, for attention. Bernard, she whispered, a little breathless now, trying to push him away, but he wouldn't budge. His massive body held her in place. She tried again, but the resistance only made her more aware of how tightly his paws pressed against her chest. As she sat up trying to compose herself, Bernard shifted beside her, his usual playful energy subdued, almost as if he understood the moment had passed. When Ronnie and the kids reappeared, all laughter and joy once again, Sophia smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something had shifted inside her, and she couldn't yet make sense of it, but for now, she smiled, pretending everything was normal. The day was still beautiful after all. The picnic, in theory, was still a success. But in her heart, she knew something had shifted in a way that would never be undone. Sophia couldn't shake the sense of being watched. It wasn't a physical sensation, not something she could place with any certainty, but there was an odd, unsettling tension in the air. She shifted on the blanket, trying to stretch her stiff limbs, but it didn't help. The sense of unease only deepened, as though the quiet of the woods had become a weight pressing down on her chest. She glanced over at Bernard, who had been lying lazily at her feet just a few moments ago. The dog's massive frame was stretched out on the blanket, his head now raised and his brown eyes fixed on her with an intensity she hadn't noticed before. At first, it was comforting. He was always so loyal, so steady. He had a way of looking at her as if he understood, as if he could see the parts of her that she kept hidden from everyone else. But today, something was different. The dog's gaze lingered, his expression a curious mix of concern and something else, something that made Sophia even more exposed. She swallowed hard, trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened under his gaze. Was it just her imagination, or was there something almost human in his eyes? She shifted uncomfortably, wrapping her arms around herself. The air had become noticeably colder, the crispness of the autumn day settling deeper into her bones. She thought of calling out for Ronnie, asking if he was almost back, but the words felt hollow, as though she were trying to fill a void that had been growing for far longer than just today. Bernard shifted beside her, his large frame slowly inching closer. His nose nuzzled against her leg, a familiar gesture that used to bring her comfort, but now it felt different, more insistent. She could feel the warmth of his breath against her skin and the way his weight seemed to press down beside her. His paw, massive and soft, came up to rest gently on her knee, as if he were trying to reach her in some way. "Bernard, what's wrong?" she murmured, a nervous laugh escaping her lips as she petted his head, trying to ease the strange tension that seemed to be building between them. But instead of pulling away, the dog leaned in closer, his large head nudging her hand until she stopped moving. It was as though he wanted something from her, something she couldn't understand. For a moment, she considered standing up, walking away from the dog, finding the safety of the campfire that was crackling in the distance. But the idea of being alone, isolated even more, felt impossible. The world felt too distant, too quiet. Bernard's eyes never left hers, and she noticed then he was waiting for something. His gaze was steady, patient, almost expectant, as though he had always known what was coming, and it was only a matter of time before she did too. Her heart began to race as a thought flickered in her mind. Could it be possible? Could she be so starved for connection that she was projecting something entirely unreal onto the dog? The absurdity of it made her laugh nervously, but her laugh died in her throat as Bernard's paw moved again. This time, it pressed more firmly against her thigh, a silent command that made her feel as though she were trapped in some kind of trance. She stared at him, at the way his large dark eyes held her captive, and for the first time she felt unsure. Uncertain of what she was experiencing, of what she was supposed to do. It was an unsettling feeling, something primal that stirred deep within her, something that made her feel like she was being led by forces outside her control. Her thoughts scrambled for an explanation. She'd never considered this kind of intimacy with Bernard, not in her wildest imaginings. But his presence was undeniable, and right now he was all she had. Her husband, distant and absorbed in his work, was out of reach. Her children, too young to notice the things that gnawed at her, were nowhere near. The only warmth left in the world was this dog, this massive creature with eyes that seemed to understand the aching spaces in her life. Suddenly, her hand was no longer in control. She felt herself reaching out, brushing her fingers lightly against his fur. It was a simple gesture, one of comfort, but the moment her skin met his, something shifted. The warmth of his body seemed to radiate through her fingertips, stirring an unfamiliar sensation. A desire she didn't know how to name. Sophia jerked her hand back, her breath catching in her throat. What was happening? What was she thinking? But Bernard, persistent as ever, didn't back away. He inched closer, his nose nudging her again, this time against her chest. The contact was soft, but it sent an electric shiver through her, and she gasped, instinctively pulling back. Her eyes darted around the campsite, hoping that anyone would appear and break the strange tension that was building around her, but there was no one. Just her and Bernard, and the thickening quiet of the forest. She closed her eyes, fighting the panic rising in her throat. What was this? What was she feeling? In the deepest recesses of her mind, she realized, whether she wanted to admit it or not, that she was lonely. Desperately lonely. Ronnie's work had become all-consuming. The children, though loved, were too young to understand the fissures growing between her and her husband. And now, in this quiet, empty space, she was left to confront herself. Her need for connection had never felt so raw, so exposed. And strangely, she found herself wishing for someone to fill that void, even if it wasn't who or what she thought it should be. But as the moments stretched on and Bernard pressed himself closer, the line between comfort and discomfort began to blur. Sophia's breath quickened again, and her hands trembled slightly as Bernard's large, warm body settled against her. She could feel his steady heartbeat through the thickness of his fur, and something in her cracked just for a second. It was a fleeting, dangerous thought that whispered in her ear, urging her to accept what was happening, to let go of her inhibitions. But before she could act on it, the sound of footsteps, faint at first, but growing closer, reached her ear. It was Ronnie's voice calling out to her from the edge of the woods. "Sophia, you okay?" he asked, his tone far too casual, unaware of the storm that was beginning to brew just a few feet away. Her heart dropped. The moment breaking as Bernard lifted his head, his gaze no longer locked on her. The silence returned, but now it was heavier, thicker, and more suffocating than before. Sophia blinked hard, willing herself to return to reality, but the question still lingered in her mind. What had she almost done? Ronnie appeared in the clearing. His face creased in mild concern, but she couldn't bring herself to look at him. She could only feel the weight of the moment pressing down, the strange, conflicting emotions swirling within her. Everything all right? Ronnie asked again, his voice softer this time. Sophia forced a smile, her throat tight. Yeah, just tired, she said, her voice shaky. It's been a long day. Ronnie nodded, looking down at Bernard, who was now lounging quietly beside her. He smiled, but Sophia could see the disconnection in his eyes, the same one that had been there for months, maybe longer. As he turned to gather the firewood with the kids, Sophia stayed on the blanket, her gaze lingering on the dog, still lying beside her, his eyes unreadable. The tension hadn't fully lifted, it still hung in the air, thick and unspoken. But now she had a new question haunting her. How much of what had just happened was real? The answer seemed to evade her as she slowly stood up, brushing the dirt off her pants. She didn't know how much longer she could ignore it, but for now, she would pretend. The quiet between Sophia and Bernard deepened, a kind of silence that hung heavily thick with unspoken words. Bernard shifted, rising to his paws and walking closer, his large frame causing the blanket to tremble slightly under his weight. She instinctively reached out to pat his head, seeking the comfort of his familiar presence. But his body stiffened, his fur bristling beneath her hand as he stood very still. His eyes never leaving hers, Sophia's heart began to race, her breath catching in her throat. There was something different in his posture now, something that made her feel small, vulnerable. The dog was no longer simply a companion, it had become an unpredictable force, one she couldn't read. She pulled her hand back, instinctively wrapping her arms around herself. The seconds stretched, each one heavier than the last. She should have stood up, walked away, but her limbs felt frozen. There was something magnetic in his gaze, a pull that kept her rooted to the spot. And then, without warning, Bernard moved. It was swift, almost too fast for her to register, but before she could react, his massive body was close enough for her to feel the warmth of his breath against her skin. The scent of the earth, mixed with the sharpness of pine, lingered around him. Sophia stiffened, her pulse quickening. She wasn't sure what she feared more, the closeness of the dog or her own growing sense of discomfort. She had always known Bernard to be affectionate, always content to rest by her side, but this felt different. The intensity of his presence was almost possessive, as though he were claiming her in some way. She couldn't explain it, but it gnawed at her. A distant sound of footsteps interrupted the moment. The crackling of leaves from the woods, Ronnie perhaps, or the kids brought her out of her stupor. Her muscles relaxed slightly, the tension of the moment easing just enough to allow her to breathe. She stood quickly, brushing off her clothes and looking away from Bernard, who had resumed his position, lying quietly once again on the blanket, though his gaze never wavered from her. As she walked over to the edge of the camp, she could hear the sound of Ronnie's voice in the distance, calling out to the kids. A part of her wanted to run to him, to close the gap between them, to escape the uncomfortable weight of what had just transpired. But something held her back. She didn't understand what was happening, why she was so shaken by something so seemingly innocuous. She told herself it was nothing, that it was just her imagination. The isolation, the stillness, the cool air was all too much. The familiar comfort of being alone with her thoughts had taken a darker turn, one she couldn't shake. She glanced back at the blanket, half expecting Bernard to be watching her with that same intense, unsettling gaze. But he was lying down, his eyes closed now as if nothing had happened. Sophia exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples as if trying to shake off the remnants of the strange feeling that had settled inside her. It was ridiculous, she told herself. She was overreacting. Bernard was just a dog, after all, but even as she reassured herself, a whisper of doubt lingered. Something had shifted, something small yet undeniable. She had to admit, despite her best efforts to ignore it, that there was a tension between them, one that couldn't easily be explained away. And no matter how hard she tried to push the thought out of her mind, she couldn't help but wonder, what was Bernard trying to tell her? And why did it feel as if something inside her had changed in response? The sound of the kids running back to camp, their laughter breaking the silence once more, was a welcome distraction. It pulled her away from her spiraling thoughts. Ronnie appeared a moment later, smiling, looking satisfied from his trip into the woods. He didn't notice anything amiss. He greeted her with a casual kiss on the cheek, his eyes scanning the camp as if everything were perfectly normal. For a moment, Sophia almost believed it was almost, but the lingering discomfort in her chest was still there, an uninvited guest that wouldn't leave. As they settled down to eat, the normalcy of their routine seemed to return. But the unease in Sophia's heart remained simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the next moment when it would reveal itself again. Sophia sat frozen, her heart hammering in her chest as the tension in the air thickened. Bernard's comforting now felt stifling, almost overwhelming. Yes, woman. She couldn't pinpoint what had shifted, but something about the way he stood there so close, so still, unsettled her more than it ever had before. The dog's gaze never left her, his dark eyes locking with hers in a way that seemed too intense, too personal. A small shiver ran down her spine, and she instinctively looked around as if expecting someone to appear from the woods, but there was nothing. Ronnie and the kids were still gone, lost somewhere between the trees. It felt as though the entire world had narrowed down to this single moment, just her and the dog. She swallowed, trying to calm the storm rising in her chest. What was happening to her? Was it just the isolation, the loneliness? Or was there something else? Something she wasn't ready to confront? She shook her head, trying to brush off the uncomfortable thoughts. It's just the quiet, she murmured, almost to herself. It's just too quiet. But the more she tried to convince herself, the more the sense of unease grew. Bernard took a step closer, his massive body blocking the light, casting a shadow over her. She wanted to pull away, to get up and walk to the campfire to call for Ronnie, but her body refused to move. In that moment, she understood that it wasn't just Bernard's presence that made her feel cornered. It was the silence louder than any sound. The silence that filled the space between her and Ronnie, the distance that had only grown since they'd started drifting apart. She hadn't wanted to admit it, but it had been there for months. This quiet disconnection, a gap between them that neither of them knew how to fill. Now, as she sat there with Bernard, that same silence pressed in on her unbearable. The dog nudged her hand gently, almost as if to remind her he was there, but the touch felt different now. Her fingers twitched involuntarily, her nails digging into her palm as she fought the urge to pull away. What was wrong with her? Why couldn't she just accept his companionship the way she always had? Why did everything feel so wrong? A sudden gust of wind rustled the leaves, bringing with it the faint scent of wood smoke and the crisp, fresh air of the forest. The momentary distraction made her inhale deeply, but even the clean, earthy scent couldn't clear the heaviness in the pit of her stomach. She looked up at the sky, trying to steady herself, but all she could see was the vastness of the woods surrounding them, endless, empty. A quiet noise broke the stillness, the sound of twigs snapping underfoot. Sophia's heart skipped a beat, and she turned her head, half expecting to see Ronnie and the children returning. But it was not Ronnie who emerged from the woods. Bernard's low growl rumbled through the air, his ears flattening against his head. Sophia froze. The figure stepping into view wasn't human, it was another dog. A large, imposing canine, its eyes glowing with an unsettling intelligence. It was as if the forest itself had birthed the creature, its presence suddenly tangible, pressing against her. Bernard, usually the protector, stood still, watching, waiting. Sophia's pulse quickened as the strange dog approached, its posture threatening, yet controlled. It didn't bark or snarl. It simply walked forward, its eyes locked on hers with unnerving clarity. In that moment, something inside her snapped. She realized she wasn't just afraid of the animal standing before her or even of the silence. She was afraid of what this all represented, how it mirrored the emptiness in her life, the gaps between herself and Ronnie, the way she had let things go unaddressed for far too long. This was not just about the dog. This was about everything she had been running from. Sophia's breath came in sharp, uneven gasps as she stood up abruptly, her legs unsteady beneath her. The cold bite of the air hit her, but it couldn't erase the suffocating sense of confinement, the overwhelming knowledge that she was alone in more ways than one. "Bernard," she whispered, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the dog, normally so responsive to her voice, remained eerily silent. His attention now focused entirely on the strange canine. The figure stopped just a few feet from her, watching with unnerving patience. She felt the weight of its gaze press against her, and for the first time, she was truly afraid not of the dog, but of what it symbolized. What had she become? What had she become? What had this moment turned into? How long had she been this lost, this isolated, trapped in a life she hadn't chosen but couldn't escape from? As the two dogs stood in a tense standoff, she felt it the sharp, undeniable truth. She had been waiting for something to change, but it was never about external forces. It was about her own choices, her own denial, her own fears that had brought her to this moment. And now, faced with the choice to confront or run, Sophia knew she couldn't keep pretending. Not anymore. Sophia's mind raced, a mixture of confusion and an unsettling sense of dread clouding her thoughts. It wasn't just the dog anymore. It was the overwhelming sense isolation she felt of being trapped in a world where she had lost her bearings. The forest, once a peaceful retreat, now felt suffocating. The air was thick, as though the trees themselves were closing in on her, their whispers barely audible in the breeze. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to regain control. But the silence was deafening, broken only by the soft rustle of leaves. Her heartbeat was loud in her ears, her palms clammy against the rough fabric of the blanket. The warmth of the sun had long since disappeared, replaced by the creeping chill of the evening. Bernard moved again, this time nudging her arm with his cold, wet nose. She flinched, but this time she didn't pull away. She couldn't. There was a deep, visceral connection between her and the dog, something that felt almost too real to dismiss. His presence wasn't just physical, it had become a part of her, a thread weaving its way through the fabric of her thoughts. The moment hung in the air, fragile, like the first crack in a mirror that would soon shatter. She wasn't sure what to make of it. Was she being paranoid? Or was this just her mind, unraveling under the weight of years of unmet desires, of a marriage that had long since faded into routine? Suddenly, the sound of footsteps broke the tension. They were distant at first, barely audible over the quiet buzz of her thoughts. Then they grew louder, unmistakable Ronnie's voice calling out from the woods, his laughter trailing behind the children. The familiar noise, the life of the family, came rushing back into the stillness. And just like that, the spell was broken. Sophia stood quickly, brushing off the stray strands of hair that had fallen across her face. Her heart was still racing, her pulse hammering in her chest, but the reality of her situation, the world she had left behind in her head, started to settle back into place. She forced herself to take a deep breath and steady her hands. Bernard remained where he was, his gaze still fixed on her, but his posture had softened, as though he had returned to his place as just a dog, just a companion. She looked at him, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but there were no answers in his eyes, only the quiet, unspoken understanding that had always existed between them. "Hey, Ronnie?" she called out, trying to sound normal to mask the panic that still clawed at the back of her throat. "Over here." Ronnie appeared from the trees carrying a bundle of firewood, his face flushed with the exertion of his task. The kids followed behind, laughing, oblivious to the tension that had gripped their mother just moments before. "Everything all right?" Ronnie asked, his voice laced with concern. He set the firewood down beside her and looked around, sensing that something was off. Sophia nodded, her smile tight. "Yeah, just needed a moment," she said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil she had just experienced. "It's just so quiet here, you know? I guess I just got lost in my thoughts." Ronnie nodded, offering a sympathetic smile. "You should have come with us." The kids found some great spots to gather more wood. It's peaceful out there, not as isolated. The words hung in the air for a moment, heavy with the weight of the underlying truths that neither of them had addressed. Ronnie's attention had already shifted to the kids, who were now running back toward the campfire, their laughter filling the space between them. Sophia looked down at Bernard, who had slowly curled up next to the blanket once again. His brown eyes met hers, as though silently acknowledging the fragile nature of the moment. She didn't know what to say, how to explain what had just transpired between them, or if it even needed to be explained. The night descended quickly, and the family gathered around the campfire, the flickering light casting long shadows across the clearing. The tension that had gripped Sophia earlier seemed to dissipate, replaced by the warmth of the fire and the gentle hum of family life returning to its familiar rhythm. But inside, Sophia felt the stirrings of something darker, a question she couldn't ignore, a feeling she couldn't shake. As the night wore on, she found herself glancing at Bernard again and again, a quiet unease taking root in the pit of her stomach. What had happened today? Was it just her mind playing tricks on her? Or had something truly shifted in the bond they shared? She didn't know, but she felt the edges of something unraveling, something that had been buried for far too long. Ronnie caught her gaze and smiled, but she couldn't bring herself to smile back. There was a new layer of distance between them, a space she couldn't bridge, no matter how hard she tried. The family was together again, but Sophia felt more alone than ever. The unspoken truth was beginning to surface, and she didn't know how much longer she could keep pretending everything was fine. The fire crackled and popped, the flames casting fleeting shadows across the clearing. Sophia couldn't help but wonder if the truth, like the fire, would eventually burn too hot to control. Um, too hot to control. She just hoped she could hold it together long enough to figure out what to do next. And somewhere deep inside her, she knew it was only a matter of time before everything would come to a head.